a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near, and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, as is Becky Kovach. We're talking all about American Gods Season 2 today. It has been quite some time since we talked about Season 1, so I don't have any recollection of our conversation, Becky, but I had fun watching Season 2.
Yeah, it's been, like you said, a very long time, so it was a little bit hard picking up with Season 2. I probably should have rewatched the first one because I jumped into Season 2 and was like, I don't remember who anybody is or what's going on or where we left off. So that was fun to figure it out. But yeah, it was a really good season. I think the show is really well done in the way that they adapt the book. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I thankfully remembered most of the characters, and there were a few new additions because you had Gillian Anderson, who did not come back, or Gillian Anderson, I'm not really sure which still, but she did not come back, and so she basically had this sort of replacement, but not exactly the same character, so to speak. It was like a new version of her character almost.
Yes, she played Media, right?
Yeah.
So they had like the new Media, which I thought was kind of like, it was weird that they changed actresses from one season to the next, but I also thought that it kind of makes sense just for like modern times.
Yeah, the thing is with Season 2, you have almost a 2-year gap after Season 1 had aired before this one even finished up, and there were a lot of production problems, if I'm remembering correctly, because in Season 1 you had Brian Fuller and Michael Green, who were heavily involved. They wrote the first 4 episodes, at least, of Season 1, which was, half of the season, and then they had little to no involvement in Season 2, so everyone was kind of like, oh no, what's going to happen? Is it going to be good? And I thought it was still good despite all of the production issues I had heard about, and the fact that you then have a big name actress in the world of television leaving and sort of just moving on from it. Who knows if that was something that was because of what was going on the production end or what, or just her availability was no longer there. So I was a little worried going into this season, I have to admit.
I didn't even know any of that. So I didn't really have any of that like preconceived expectations, which I guess works in my favor too, just because I feel like if you go into things with expectations, a lot of times whatever you're doing, it's not going to meet them. So going into Season 2, it was more just like me not remembering things. Yeah. So it was almost like seeing a lot of this through like fresh eyes, like these characters and the way they're portrayed.
Yeah, and you have the fact that this story is quite a bit different from Season 1. So you have a continuation, but not exactly to the point where you need to remember everything from Season 1 to understand this season, it felt like.
Yes, I think that like having seen Season 1, it does give you a little bit of like the background of who the characters are and stuff, and that's very helpful.
Yeah.
But otherwise, like once you know who the characters are and know what their roles are, you can kind of watch the second season without having seen the first.
I wouldn't recommend that, though. Definitely watch both seasons if you have not done so already. And if you haven't watched Season 2 for any reason, you should probably stop listening here because we're going to dive into the story. And I think episode by episode is probably the best way to kind of run through this for the two of us, because I know we both took notes this way since we knew from our discussion on Season 1 how complicated things could get with this show.
Yes, there's a lot of overlapping storylines and a lot of jumping back and forth between like past and present, and also something that I found was just like a common thread throughout the season was that it can be very hard to distinguish what is reality at certain times.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to jump right in with episode 1, they kind of hit you with this sort of reunion almost. You're kind of getting all of the characters back together again, and there's this diner that just shows off the set design work for this series so well.
Yeah, and even before that, they go on the carousel ride, which was just like a stunning set in itself.
Yeah, they do a really good job of just giving you these, beautiful set pieces to look at. And it's almost distracting from the story at times because you get these scenes that are so busy with the set pieces that you're kind of looking around for any Easter eggs or something to give something else away in the story. And you could spend so much time looking at these sets for little things like that.
Yeah. I know, like, one of my favorite things since I was a kid is when I'm watching a movie or a TV show or something, instead of focusing on whatever is clearly meant to be like the center of any particular scene, I love looking at what's around them and what the people around them are doing. So that's something that, like, I definitely struggled a lot with on this because, like you said, the sets and the pieces that are within the set are so, like, well done and so beautiful on their own.
Yeah, plus they hit you with a death right in episode 1, and you're like, oh, okay, that's how this season's going to go, apparently. And, it doesn't seem like Wednesday really cares about a lot of people, but you have this death of Zariah, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly. These names kind of get crazy too, and I'm just like, I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, Zariah seems to be one of the few people, or I guess gods, that Wednesday actually does care about. And that's a relationship that they really established well in the first season. Was something that upon rewatching season 1 that kind of came back to me.
Mm-hmm.
They don't wait long to kill somebody.
You also have the fact that there's this war brewing between Mr. Wednesday and, I guess, really Mr. World. It's a little muddy at the start of the season, like who is on what side, and you have Bilquis. Oh my goodness, I am so bad at names, Becky, but she is kind of playing both sides of the fence for a while until she can decide what she wants to do.
Yeah, she doesn't seem to have made up her mind. It feels like she's one of those, like, characters who's going to wait and see who's going to come out on top and then throw their chips in that basket. So she kind of, like, goes back and forth.
You kind of can't blame her either.
I guess not, but also, like, loyalty, pick a side.
That's fair, but I don't know if I would trust Mr. Wednesday.
I wouldn't trust Mr. World either, though, is part of the problem.
I think that is a big part of the problem because Mr. Wednesday is known to be a con artist. And then you have Mr. World, who just seems so full of himself, to say the least. And it's just so unappealing. And you're kind of like, I don't really want to be on your side either.
Yeah. He also, he plays the creepiest characters, that actor in particular. And I think I still will always see him as the creepy guy from, like, the Charlie's Angels movie.
Okay. I have not seen that.
Okay. Well, he plays, like, a very creepy character in that, too. So seeing him in this, I still have that in the back of my head. And then the way he portrays Mr. World just kind of adds to it.
Got it.
It's, like, slimy. Just like a tiny person.
And there are some actors who are just so great at playing those kind of roles. So at least, it fits with previous roles that he's played. And it's always fun when you make those connections. But, episode 2, we see her working more with Mr. World than anyone else. And you can tell she's also just in it for herself. Like, she doesn't really want to be caught in the middle, but she wants to know what each side is going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, she's just kind of waiting to see what everybody's plan is. And she is clearly going to pick whichever side she thinks is winning.
Mm-hmm.
But she's kind of hedging her bets in the meantime.
Yeah, what did you think of the flashback scene in episode 2 where they show us that Shadow met Mr. Wednesday before all of this stuff happened without even realizing it?
I really enjoyed the flashbacks to Shadow's childhood and learning more about him and his relationship with his mother, and hearing her kind of talk about like how he has to behave and how he has to kind of like hold himself. It also like was an episode that felt very relevant to modern times, just because Shadow is attacked by these other kids because they think he's too white. They say that he's like a white kid, and he's like, I'm not though. And it just was like it was touching upon like racial issues, and it was just something that like watching that in today's world, it just felt very like real.
Yeah, and because this season came out last year, while it was still relevant, I think just the fact that you and I chose to watch this year instead of watching it relatively closer to when it came out, it was one of those things where it's just kind of strange to see how something from a year ago could be even more relevant in the present day.
Yeah, which is like a really like it's a good point to the show. It aged well.
Yeah,
in that respect.
Oh yeah, and I think we're supposed to get another new season this year, but I suppose that depends on whether or not production had wrapped up prior to COVID hitting, because we're still, sort of in the thick of that because reasons, I guess. And, I will be curious to see if you and I managed to watch season 3 faster than we did season 1 or season 2.
I'm going to say yes. Having just seen season 2, I'm like, okay, I'm ready for season 3. Bring it on.
Yeah, and this is a show that probably has a shelf life of, 3 or 4 seasons, give or take, based on the book. And whether or not they choose to go beyond that, at this point, I know you and I talked about the book, but I don't remember exact details from the book because that was even longer ago. I think we did that first and then started diving into the show. But you get the sense with this season that they really wanted to just keep pushing the story, and they wanted to fill in information with these flashbacks, especially in episode 2. And I like when they don't force information upon you. Like, you don't have Shadow giving this whole monologue about how he was bullied when he was a kid. Instead, they show it to you, and that flashback has a purpose. It's when he meets Mr. Wednesday for the first time without realizing it. So they're not just throwing this information in to throw it in. It has a purpose, and that's when I don't mind flashbacks quite as much.
Yeah, same. And I think, if I remember correctly, when they released season 1, they said that they were going to do the book in 3 seasons.
Okay.
So I think the next season might be the last one. So it makes sense that they're like the pacing of this season kind of makes sense in that respect, because we do feel it kind of building towards like the conflict, the war between the old gods and the new gods.
Yeah, and they do a very nice job building up to that. And with the 3rd episode, one, I was very sad that Mr. Wednesday destroyed an entire library of stuff. It really hurt me. Yeah, that was sad to watch. But it does introduce new media, and we see Laura getting all patched up because we know she's very dead. Now she's very undead and kind of like
falling apart.
Sally from A Nightmare Before Christmas almost.
Yeah, she's kind of falling apart at the seams and kind of rotting as well. There's something wrong with Mad Sweeney's coin, that it's like not enough for her to maintain whatever kind of life that she has.
Yeah, and it's so great how they do the imagery for that, because obviously, there's some CGI and whatnot, because they literally like pull off her arm and she's just kind of holding her arm. But it really felt like something from A Nightmare Before Christmas when she's taken and, they start patching her up, and you really just get a sense that you can tell where some influences come from when you get into, Neil Gaiman's work, Stephen King's work. You can see these prior influences trickling their way into these stories. And I don't remember if this was exactly that way in the book, but seeing it on screen, you're like, oh, I can make this correlation now.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that we haven't really touched on yet within these first couple episodes is the fact that Shadow is also kidnapped. He's taken in episode 2, and the only reason that Laura is putting up with Mr. Wednesday through 2 and 3 is because she just wants to find Shadow. She's like kind of fixated on him.
Well, I know I wasn't super fond of how Laura and Shadow's relationship was kind of playing out in season 1, and I'm still not a fan of the nickname Puppy. You know, it's
no,
kind of weird for a man who is that large and does not look like a puppy at all, in my opinion.
No, it's definitely a weird nickname, and it kind of just shows how she feels about him in the respect that, like, she definitely thinks that she can control him, and he's just going to follow her around like a lost little puppy. Which, like, in season 1, I think that was definitely kind of true, especially seeing like flashbacks to how their relationship started. But in season 2, I think we're kind of moving further and further away from that image of Shadow.
Absolutely. In episode 3, we see Shadow hitch a ride. And then once we roll into episode 4, Mr. Wednesday gives him an out, but he still sticks with him. So you're kind of like, oh boy, Shadow is going to stick with Mr. Wednesday and he's going to have to suffer these consequences. And he really does, because then everyone ends up being after him as the season progresses. You know, the FBI and all of this crazy stuff is going on. But episode 4 does give you that face-to-face moment with Mr. Wednesday and Mr. World. And I think because that's, you know, closing out of the first half of the season, they had to do something attention-grabbing.
Yeah, and I think it was Money who brings Mr. World to Wednesday. And like the whole portrayal of Money, I thought was very funny. And kind of some much needed comic relief within the season.
Yeah, and in episode 4 too, you see what it's like for someone to be on Mr. World's bad side when Technical Boy screws up, and you're just kind of like, oh, okay, this is a guy we actually need to be worried about.
Yes. It shows you just like how quickly his opinion of somebody can change.
Yeah, so first half of the season is really feeling like the story is getting going again. You know, because of having such a long break in between seasons, it's not like it came out, 3 years in a row for these 3 seasons. It was 4 by chance, which leaves this sort of awkward gap between seasons 1 and 2. So they kind of had to reintroduce you to what's going on. And I think because they give you that sort of reunion in episode 1, they're getting you back into the groove of being with these characters, and then you're figuring out what exactly is going on over the next few episodes. And once you get that face-to-face with Mr. Wednesday and Mr. World, you're kind of like, okay, things are going to really ramp up in the second half of this season.
Yeah. Like you said earlier, the pacing is just, it very much feels like it is moving quicker and quicker towards this main conflict that we know is kind of building up within the series.
Yeah, and episode 5, you have people going their separate ways. Mad, Sweeney, and Laura go to New Orleans. Shadow's learning about the events that happened in Cairo. He's also still affected by this brutal death that he experienced, not himself, obviously, but he is still being impacted by things that happened years prior. And you get all of this emotion building up in the second half of the season too. And because of how much of the story with American Gods is kind of blurred between what the gods can do and sort of this fantasy magic element to where you don't really know what's going on sometimes. And when you get those scenes in New Orleans with Mad Sweeney and Laura, and you have all this madness going on around them, you're kind of like, wait, did that actually happen? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and this was another instance where I was kind of not sure like what was reality and what was just kind of in somebody's head. Like when they go see the voodoo man and Laura and Sweeney kind of have an intimate relationship, like it was kind of moving in that direction anyway. Like you can start to kind of get the sense that Sweeney has feelings for Laura, but I still walked away from that episode like not really being sure if that was real or not. And same thing with like Shadow seeing this violent death of somebody he'd never even met. And this was another episode where it just felt very relevant to what's going on in the world right now, just in terms of like racism and race relations and things like that. So it was a lot of just like not knowing what was real and what wasn't.
Yeah, there's a lot of heavy moments throughout this season. And I think then when you're trying to figure out what's real and what's not, it sort of impacts that emotion, not necessarily in a negative way, but then there's just sort of this uncertainty surrounding a lot of things. And then you have this whole burlesque show in the next episode that is just so bizarre. And, you know, Mr. Wednesday is kind of at the center and the forefront of it. And you're like, okay, this has to be in someone's head, right?
Yes. I really liked episode 6 and the flashbacks to Wednesday's past and learning more about him and his relationship with his son and what happened to his son. Because I think it does tell us a lot more about why he acts the way he does, like in the modern day.
Yeah, absolutely. And because he's a god, you know, all of these characters with these insane powers are based on various gods and goddesses. And while my history lesson of the gods and goddesses is not very strong, it really feels like that episode gave you a sense of who Mr. Wednesday is as a god, as a father, and just in general.
Yeah. And it's not great because we see him essentially trying to control his son Thor's life. Thor wants to run away and start a new life with the woman that he loves, and Wednesday lies to both of them to put a stop to it and to get Thor to do what he wants. And as a result, Thor takes his own life.
Yeah, this is not your Marvel Thor by any means.
No. I mean, when you think of the gods, you think of them as being practically immortal. Obviously, we saw Zariah die earlier in the season, so they can die, but it kind of just drives home the fact that like these gods are in danger, they can be killed. So this war is more crucial than ever.
And not only does episode 6 tell you more about Mr. Wednesday, but it gives you this object that you need to focus on in his spear because he needs that. And we see what happens to that specific object. And while everything else I think is more important as far as background information, that spear is the one thing that they're banking on, it seems like.
Yes. And the story of them fixing the spear also does provide some more comic relief from those very heavy moments. Them just like tricking the guy in the shop into giving them Lou Reed's jacket of all things to trade the dwarves so that the dwarves will fix the spear.
Yeah, that was a pretty funny moment. And so now that we have seen more of Shadow's background, we've seen more of Mr. Wednesday's background, and then episode 7 gives us more of Mad Sweeney's background. It feels like this season is the season where they were like, okay, this is the part of the story where we can go back and revisit these characters' lives before we even met them in season 1 and give you some more context to why they are the way they are. So I think the character work that they did in season 2 was probably a little better than season 1, even though I might have liked season 1 a little more as a whole.
Okay. Why do you think you like season 1 better?
I think because of Shadow's journey, it seemed like he was going through a lot more personally in that season. And while he's still going through a lot of things here, he kind of doesn't really have as much tension between him and Laura. It still exists, but because they spend more time apart here, you kind of just have him doing his own thing.
Okay. See, and that's what kind of why I like season 2 better, because I don't necessarily love the dynamic between Shadow and Laura. So the fact that they spend so much more time apart, I think allowed Shadow to kind of come into his own as a character.
That's totally fair, because I'm also not a huge fan of their relationship, but I think because of that tension they had in season 1, it gave him more of a reason to do all of the things he did in season 1, and just how they built up everything between him and Mr. Wednesday in season 1. And I don't know if that's maybe because I have personally previously enjoyed stuff that Brian Fuller worked on, like Hannibal, which was an amazing show, like start to finish, in my opinion. And then, with all of the production issues, I don't know if maybe that like tampered my expectations for season 2.
It's possible.
But I still did like this season, just so we're clear. I think it did a lot of interesting things, and I think at times it might have been a little harder to follow along because of the flashbacks being somewhat more frequent, I think, in this. I don't know if we got a ton of flashbacks in season 1, but like I said, in episode 7, we get the Mad Sweeney one. And I think this might have been my least favorite of the flashbacks because it was just so bizarre.
Yeah, my thing is, I think Mad Sweeney is probably my favorite character in the series, which is very sad for me. But so I kind of enjoyed getting to see where he came from and how he ended up where he did, and what his relationship with Mr. Wednesday through the years actually was. I think it also just kind of helped to have that background, just because I was not really familiar with who he's supposed to be as a god. So at least having that like history and like his personal history, at least having that kind of helped a little bit with figuring out like his role in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, so obviously this episode, while the flashback might have been great for you, maybe the rest of it not so much, because this is where we get Sweeney's death. And I do think Mad Sweeney was the biggest part of a lot of the comic relief in season 1. And in this season, he felt a little sidelined at times because it was clear that Mr. Wednesday didn't want anything to do with him, which I think was a little unfortunate. Not as unfortunate as the character's death, of course, though.
Yeah, it does kind of feel that way, especially like he goes off to New Orleans on his own before Laura goes down to find him, and he doesn't have his coin anymore, so his luck has turned really, really poor, which is that kind of comedy within the series. So he doesn't have as big of a role in this season, I don't think. But yeah, he was I don't know, he was still just my favorite character.
I mean, he's a leprechaun, so of course there's going to be some comedic relief no matter what he does.
Especially because he's a really tall leprechaun.
Yeah, he's defying our expectations of leprechauns.
Yeah, but I think his death was like a very emotional moment within this season, both because Shadow didn't mean to kill him. That was completely an accident. And I think that has an effect on Shadow. But also because we just kind of realized that Sweeney might have feelings for Laura, and seeing his past and how tragic his background is, to have him just kind of killed, not even in a battle, but just an accident. It doesn't seem like a fair end for him.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And to have that be the penultimate episode of the season, you're just kind of like, okay, well, they killed off this character that we like. What on earth are they going to do with the finale?
Yeah. It was quite the build up to the final episode of the season.
Yeah, so there's so much to unpack with this finale, because in the penultimate episode, we see that Laura goes back to Mama G's diner, and she's a new character for season 2, and I really liked her character, and she's this waitress at a motel, but then there's like this diner where they all are at the beginning of the season. And then, it kind of comes full circle towards the end of the season. And we see at least Laura and some other people back there again. And she's the Hindu goddess of death and liberation. And you really just get the sense that she kind of wants to be left out of everything. And I love how adamant she is. Like, no, you know what? Maybe I want to be a waitress. I don't care if I'm a goddess.
Yeah, she's kind of found a place in the modern day where she can still get like what she needs in order to survive, which is something that I think a lot of the older gods are struggling with, and why they're getting weaker and weaker, because they haven't adapted with the times and they haven't found a way to fit in the modern world.
Yeah, and we brought up the whole puppy nickname earlier, and then the finale gives us the origin of how that nickname started. And you know what? I didn't really care because I still don't like it.
Absolutely not. Still not my favorite.
But I do like that Shadow finally just stands up for himself and tells her to stop calling him puppy.
Yes, that was nice. It definitely shows a lot about how far Shadow has come in the first 2 seasons, because he went from really just following her like a puppy everywhere to, like you said, standing up for himself and telling her that he's kind of had enough.
Yeah, and then you have new media basically trying to destroy his life along with Mr. Wednesday's. They're wanted literally everywhere. And honestly, Shadow has such a distinct look that I'm surprised a fake ID worked for him.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very realistic, which I know is kind of strange to say about a show that is literally the least realistic thing I've ever watched. But it doesn't make sense that a fake ID would work for him, especially when new media is trying to just kind of take him down and has his picture plastered like everywhere.
Yeah, and it does a very good job of showing just how skilled new media is. And I don't think that's to say anything bad about media from season 1, but new media seems to just take things to a whole new level because of the social media aspect and the way that she kind of travels through technology. And you get a sense that she's honestly even more threatening.
Yes, absolutely. And she doesn't really have like any, I don't know if I want to say morals, but like there's nothing that she adheres to in terms of like, this is going too far. And I think that that's something that is kind of a commentary on where the world is at today in terms of like our media consumption and social media networks, and how people just kind of take things too far. And it's too much. We're overwhelmed and overstimulated with media now.
Oh, absolutely. I'm constantly like, how many shows do I have to catch up on? How many movies have I missed out on? What do I need to watch? What do I need to consume? And having this podcast obviously gives me a semi-decent excuse to do all of those things and consume a bunch of things. But at the same time, it is so much information overload. And you're kind of like, okay, yes, we have a bunch of streaming services now, but then you probably spend almost just as much time trying to find something to watch as you do actually watching whatever you pick to watch.
Yes, it's so much. I have like a running list of all of the things that I have watched over the last, 4 months of quarantine. And even just like scrolling through that list, I'm like, what am I doing with my life?
We're mostly just playing Animal Crossing.
Yes, my 400 plus hours of Animal Crossing is in there somewhere.
I haven't even looked. I don't think I have quite that many. I've tried to like keep it to less than 30 minutes a day. So if I even play every day.
That's the smart thing to do. My roommate, I think, is at like 900. So I feel a little bit better about my own playtime.
Yeah, but I think the biggest bombshell that they drop in this episode is the fact that Mr. Wednesday might be Shadow's father. Did you catch that?
Yes. And it kind of makes sense as you look back through the earlier episodes, just because Shadow keeps pushing Mr. Wednesday to tell him, like, why me? Why did you pick me? And Mr. Wednesday just keeps insisting, like, I needed somebody who was disposable, who didn't matter. But clearly that's not true, because he also tells Shadow, like, you have a really big role in all of this. And then Shadow's fortune also, I believe, said something like father, like son. So that all kind of just like ties together. And when they kind of make this like suggestion that Mr. Wednesday is Shadow's father, you're like, oh, yes, I get it.
Everything makes so much more sense now.
Yes.
Yeah, so is there anything else you want to touch on in regards to the story for season 2? Because I felt like this was such a big ending. I almost don't know exactly how they're going to kick off season 3.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the first episode of season 3, like where it starts and how it starts. Just because with season 2, we kind of leave off Shadow is kind of on the run. Laura has run off with Sweeney's body. And I have my notes up that I wrote while I was watching. And the last thing that I wrote was just, where does this leave us with the impending battle? Because everyone's kind of gone off in their own direction.
Yeah, and you know what? We didn't even really talk about some of the characters in this. And Mr. Ibis becomes a main character in season 2, and he's sort of this keeper of past and present stories, and you get this sense that he's just so sophisticated in comparison to almost everyone else on this show.
Yeah, which is funny because he's the one who deals with dead bodies all day long.
Yeah, and then you have Mr. Nancy, who is a tailor, and, you know, like I said, some weird stuff happened with season 2 because Orlando Jones, who plays Mr. Nancy, was actually fired from the show during season 2. So you see a lot of his character, but then towards the end, you're kind of like, oh, okay. And you have Salim, who comes back, and I'm not really sure what role exactly he plays. He's kind of just always there.
He's kind of like a puppy with the djinn.
Yeah.
Like, he follows the djinn wherever he goes. They're in love, they're in a relationship, and he stays behind when things start to go wrong and new media starts going after everybody, because he wants to stay with the djinn. But yeah, he doesn't really serve.
And you can tell he's not exactly wanted, though.
No, which makes me sad. I like Salim.
Yeah. He's like this very endearing character when almost everyone else is very unlikable in this.
Yes, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that he's just so, like, not oblivious, and not innocent either, but he just doesn't realize the extent of the world in which he has kind of ingratiated himself.
Yeah, so I know we didn't dive deep into all of the characters in season 2, but really, most of the story has been about Mr. Wednesday and Shadow. So they're the two that a lot of the story is going to focus on. And with Mad Sweeney possibly out of the picture for season 3, it's unclear because Laura came back, so maybe he can too.
Right. And the sense that I got was that she's taking his body to find a way to bring him back.
Yeah. Which
I could be wrong, but that was just like, why else would she have taken his body?
Especially when she claims to not like him so much.
Right. I don't know. They kind of go off on their own adventures a lot in this season. And I kind of, like, I don't like her relationship with Shadow, but I grew to really like the relationship between her and Sweeney.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting B plot for this season because it's not the main focus, but it's something you end up focusing on just because those two characters feel more compelling together than her and Shadow ever did.
Right. And Sweeney takes Laura to go look for Shadow when he's kidnapped, and then he tries to convince her to come with him to New Orleans to, like, fix whatever is wrong with her. He claims to get his luck back because she still has his coin, but I think that there's more to it than that.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in season 3 because with the Orlando Jones and Mr. Nancy thing, he claims one thing, and then a spokesperson said that his contract just wasn't renewed because the character isn't in the part of the book that the season 3 episodes are based on. And I looked at the titles for the season 3 episodes because they already have those up on Wikipedia, and you can't really get a sense of what's going to happen because it's like vague kind of stuff. A Winter's Tale is the first episode.
Oh.
Fire and Ice is one of the episodes. And
all right, what is this, Game of Thrones?
I know, that was the feeling I got, and I've never even seen Game of Thrones. I was like, this feels very Game of Thrones-esque here, and it's like conscious of the king. And like,
oh God. I honestly didn't even realize all of the stuff with Orlando Jones. So now I am very curious as to how that will affect season 3, because I don't remember. It's been so long since I've read the book. I don't remember if he makes an appearance in the last third of the book or not.
Yeah. Part of me wants to reread the book, but because of all the Stephen King reading I do for Chat Cemetery, I'm just like, I cannot take on a Neil Gaiman book right now.
I told myself I was going to read more this year, and then quarantine happened, and I just haven't had the motivation to read. So I am just now starting to get back into reading, and I'm starting off slow and with something easy. And I know that Neil Gaiman books tend to be kind of not super dense, not like Stephen King dense, but they are the kind of books that like you do want to take your time reading. So I don't know that I will be getting to American Gods again anytime soon, but if I'm feeling inspired, I might.
Good to know. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up here?
No, I think that kind of covers all of the main points. And like you said, we didn't talk super in depth about some of the characters, but they also weren't really the main focus of this season. So I think that's okay.
Yeah, and you mentioned you like this season a little better. I still like season 1 a little better. And I do think some of that has to do with the cast members from season 1 who did not appear in season 2. Like, you had this big grand performance from Kristen Chenoweth in season 1, and you don't really get the same kind of equivalent in season 2. And then, like I said, media versus new media. While I like the actress better in season 1, I understand why they made that change and sort of had new media come in because it made sense for this particular storyline.
Yeah, agreed.
Awesome. Well, Becky, I know you will be back for something else before we eventually get American Gods season 3 done, but it's been fun chatting about this season with you. So thank you for coming on to do that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I am very excited for season 3 and to see how they kind of wrap things up if this is the last season. Like I said, I think I remember them saying it was only going to be 3, but I don't remember. It's been a very long time since the first season came out.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of been a wild ride for this show behind the scenes. So I'll probably dive into it a little more and see what's what and if there have been any other major casting changes aside from Orlando Jones.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I will talk to you again soon.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, everyone, that does it for this episode of Welcome to Geekdom. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so through our Patreon. You can sign up for $1 a month. That'll get you a thank you on the show. $2 a month, you get to pick a topic that myself and a guest will discuss on the show. For $5 a month, you can join the Welcome to Geekdom Slack group, where you can talk to myself and various guests who have been on the show. If you want to follow us on socials, you can do so at GeekdomPod on Twitter and at Welcome to Geekdom on Instagram and Facebook. If you feel inclined, please do give us a review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen. It really does help the show. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.